So we're going to talk about the idea of power and how you have a discourse about power. How do you manage these multiple identities and how you interact with the world, where perhaps the world does not value one of your identities as much as another one. Up on the slide here we have Bell Hooks, and she teaches at Berea University. She is looking at the topic of postmodern and postmodern blackness. A lot of black scholars say they don't value that idea, value that discussion of other, or mostly that's focusing on people who are European or some other thing. So black scholars don't value the concept of postmodernism, but Bell Hooks disagrees. She talks about the idea of difference and otherness, that you can't really separate the category of race or gender or black. If you forget to talk about what it means to be black or what it means to be a woman, then you're missing one piece of that discussion. And other conversations may be talking about different identities, and they overlook a discussion that doesn't include black or women, for example. So you can't look at one piece of who you are without also talking about the other pieces. So that fits the model of the portfolio that I was just mentioning. And how the identities interact is not always in an equal way, and there is power in that conversation. There's also another scholar here by the last name of Spivak from Columbia University. She wrote a very groundbreaking essay entitled, "Can the Subaltern Speak?" Can that subaltern speak? So her concern is not that it's a yes-no answer. That's not the kind of question that she was posing in her essay. They, of course, can speak, but her concern was more, is anyone listening to the subaltern? Is anyone listening to what they have to say? That was her point. So to answer the question, can the subaltern speak? Her point is more, let's hang on here just a second. The people that we are studying who are oppressed, we are the oppressors. You know, we're looking at what these oppressed people, what their lives mean, who they are, and we never ask them to speak for themselves. There's this scholarly dialogue about what's happening and what's happening with the subaltern, but we're not including them in the discussion. Their self-expression is not included in that conversation, and that's what her concern was. It's not a yes-no question. Instead, it's a, excuse me, let's step aside and let's let the people who we are studying, let them speak for themselves. So her goal, her agenda, is post-colonial studies, and she wants to move aside from that and have the experts step aside and let the subaltern people develop their own expression. Let them figure out where they're going and where they've come from. And that the experts should not look over them as oppressors and discuss their lives, but should listen to them. And experts should also not write the meaning of the subaltern's life, but let the subaltern culture talk about their meaning for them. So the question is more, is anyone listening? And I hope so, but often no one's listening to subalterns speak. Her point overall, again, is to just step back and let these people speak for themselves. We talk about the concept of agency, and it's one thing to tell the public narrative, but the other issue is to actually become the guiding light of your own agency, to invent your own story. I could talk about my experience as being oppressed and how I've been oppressed, but if I can't change my story, ultimately, I'm still oppressed. So something simple as letting people speak about their oppressed experience is not enough. You have to allow them to write their own story and to be in control of how their story is ending and how it's being shared. It's a very big challenge, and it's a very powerful connection between discourse and power. So letting people speak for themselves and also letting their stories guide themselves before we predetermine where their life is going and how their life will end. So that's a big concern of this scholar Spivak. One more thing from deaf studies on this slide here. We're going to be speaking about transnational deaf identity here. And transnational is a very hot topic in the field of scholarly research right now, and it's looking at how, for example, the African American experience and the African experience and the African Cuban experience, how they are similar, and how their identities are networked. I mean, each of them has a unique identity, and they each have their unique experiences, but there are some similarities in how their identities are shaped. And the transnational deaf identity study is in fact very similar. Deaf people, as they travel the world and meet people who are deaf from other countries, even though they each speak a different sign language, they have each been brought up in a different culture and have had different experiences growing up, and they have quite a few differences, there is still an automatic connection between deaf people from different countries because they have kinship. They have an automatic connection. This gentleman at the top of the slide, Amos Draper, was from the 1800s. In 1889, he traveled to the first International Deaf Congress, and that was happening in France. On the way, he stopped by London, and he presented to an audience of working-class deaf British people. And their sign language is very different than American Sign Language. So they're, of course, they somehow made themselves understood. Amos Draper was a very well-educated leader in the deaf community, but the people in the audience were, factory workers, working class, deaf British people. And in America, the culture was there was quite a bit of support for people who are deaf, and in Britain, it was a very different experience. But what Amos Draper shared with the audience was a quote from William Shakespeare on the slide. It's, "One touch of nature makes the whole world kin." And to Amos Draper, that one touch was being deaf. He stood up there as an American deaf man and said, "I'm deaf," and said to the British people, "You are deaf, and we are kin." And if you look at how deaf people the world over connect with each other, it's very fascinating. I've gone to Kenya, I've traveled to Zimbabwe, and I've also been to Turkey. And I've worked with deaf communities in those 3 countries. And each, of course, had their different language than what I was used to as American Sign Language. They each had their own culture, their environment, their values. Everything was very different than my experience. Socioeconomic status was very different. The political, the national power was quite diverse in these 3 countries. There were many things that on paper should have kept us apart. But the one thing that bonded us instantly was we were all deaf. We had 2 weeks together in one of these places, never spent any time apart, and at the end of that time, we were all in tears because we had to leave each other. I went to Zimbabwe and I worked with a group of deaf and hearing people together to develop a curriculum for deaf education in Zimbabwe. And most of the week was spent working with hearing people, developing this curriculum specifically. And then 2 days was spent visiting with a preschool, a deaf preschool, a deaf club that had a program for deaf people in the community. And I just dove right in with both feet and just was able to connect with these people. They were my people. They were my friends. I was able to just kind of hang out with them and see what was going on in their lives and share this commonality with them about being deaf. And with the hearing people, it was a very official tour. They went off and did what they wanted to do, and I was like, I'm staying with these people. I'm connecting with these people on a kinship level. And when it was time to leave, they talked about everything they had heard and everything they had learned about, these were the hearing people. They talked about everything they learned during that week, and I was like, I want to stay with, the deaf folks, my community here. And several times, the hearing people had to kind of nudge me like, the bus is leaving, we gotta go. Gotta get back to the hotel, we got these workshops, these curriculums we gotta get going to. And every time I felt like, oh, going back into isolation. It was a very emotional, painful time for me to be able to have to disconnect from the deaf people that I'd met there. And the hearing people in this group had no idea. It was an eye-opening experience for them to see this instant connection between me and the deaf Zimbabweans. And that touch of nature, that being deaf, was the one thing that led us to being kinship. And the hearing people who was on the trip were able to make friends with some of the hearing Zimbabweans, but they didn't have that deep, bone-deep connection that I had with the deaf Zimbabweans, because we were able to talk about our experience of being isolated or oppressed or misunderstood. So it was just interesting, fascinating, that I was able to benefit so much more from being with the deaf Zimbabweans than my hearing colleagues were able to benefit being with the hearing Zimbabweans. So how do you notice this touch of nature? That's one example. This touch of nature is being deaf. But why don't you think about what the touches of nature are in your life? Gender, or how you identify yourself in one way that gives you that touch of nature that you're able to be kin with someone else, and take advantage of that to build collaborations and partnerships. What deaf people tend to do is create temporary deaf spaces, because there is no deaf part of the community. There is no deaf part of town. We've got one part where there's a lot of people from Puerto Rico who live here, or there are a lot of people over here who are, from Chinatown, but we don't have like the deaf town. We're scattered all over in whatever community we live in. And most of the deaf people have parents who are hearing. And most deaf couples, when they expand their family and have children, the children are hearing. The only parallel to the experience of deaf people as being a one-generational experience is the LGBT community, because a lot of GLBT people have parents who are straight, who don't identify as GLBT, or gay couples tend to adopt kids, and the kids don't necessarily grow up and identify as being gay. There's no deaf part of town. And there used to be things such as deaf clubs, deaf churches, where deaf people would congregate as the community, but they have really dwindled and gone by the wayside as people have discovered other ways to connect, like through texting or email or Facebook, or that's really generational right now, creating what deaf space is, what is deaf identity, and what that connection means. And it's really changing with the technology that's out there right now. There's a lot more reliance on temporary space. And deaf camps, where children who come together for 1 week in the summertime, and they're all deaf, and they hang out, and they have that great camping experience, and they have a very valuable week in their lives. And then the other 51 weeks of the year, they don't have deaf camp. But for 1 week, they are deaf with every other deaf kid there is. They're all sharing that touch of nature, that kinship. When you have a big international deaf convention, when the deaf congregants come to that convention center, that convention becomes the deaf space. And as the end of the convention nears, those people start to figure out, how can we still connect and how can we still have kinship even as we go back to our separate lives? So that's the temporary space. They create that space and they call it deaf. Another example of this, of temporary space, is at a gay nightclub or a gay dance club. That's a temporary space, because it used to be like in the 80s and 90s. Most clubs didn't have, most gay clubs weren't able to continue and to make ends meet and to have, be gay, 100% of the time. They might have, every Thursday night is gay night. But Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday is straight night or mixed night, or Wednesday is the gay night, or Monday is lesbian night. And that became a temporary space. And it was created, and it was held by the people who came to that space. And it was very valued. It was a very safe space for people to be able to mingle with like people. But the rest of the week, that space was not safe. That one night was their space. It was worth it. It was valuable. And during the day, maybe that space, that gay club or whatever club it is, was completely empty. There was nothing on the walls, perhaps. But at that night, the lights were dimmed. The techno pop was booming, the lights were flashing, and the people were out on the dance floor, a sweaty mess. And that became magic. It was magical. So the point is that a place or a space was magical at that point. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, when the bar closed and the lights were raised, the magic was gone as you were looking out at these other people here. And they would close the bar. They all had that same experience, but when the lights came on, it felt like, oh, it's kind of an ugly building. There's really not anything on the walls here. But while you were dancing, wow, this is a great space, the coolest place on earth. This is the gay place. Oh, look at the lights coming up. Oh, I guess it's kind of dingy, it's kind of drab walls. So that is a temporary space. During the actual use of that space, it becomes magical. It becomes identified and bonded in that one moment and becomes a temporary space. So deaf people use temporary space and gay people use temporary space as well. Religious communities can also use temporary space. One example is the Hajj. In Islam, one of the 5 foundations of the faith is that people are expected, at least once in their lifetime, to make the journey to Mecca. That is the goal, is to get there. And there is a Kaaba, K-A-B-A, there's a Kaaba box there. But the Hajj is a little bit different. The Hajj is a temporary space. There are millions of Muslims from around the world, different cultures, different socioeconomic status, different languages, all dressed alike, all doing the same procession, all having that experience, that movement of the Hajj. Their multiple identities coalesce into one. They are Muslim. And the worldwide ummah means community, and it can be seen and touched and felt and experienced right there. And the rest of the year, diversity can be very overwhelming. Maybe a Muslim lives in Saudi Arabia, and how a Muslim lives in Saudi Arabia can be different than how one lives in another country or how one lives in America. But during the Hajj, when they make that procession to Mecca, they have kinship. And that is the implementation of Islam worldwide. The Middle-Aged Christian Community Center is a temporary space. The cathedral, is very permanent, and most of the time it's empty in a cathedral. But on Sundays, the priests would be speaking Latin in the Middle Ages. I don't know what they were talking about. They're just kind of speaking Latin, and I wouldn't be able to understand it. But then the minute the bread was raised, everything would stop, and all eyes would be raised and look at that bread that was being broken by the priest and the cup that was being raised by the priest. And that became a temporary space. Regardless of the diversity in the congregation, regardless of whether anyone was able to understand any one word that the priest spoke in Latin, that raising of the bread and cup bonded everyone in a kinship. So thinking about deaf temporary spaces is quite a powerful idea. How identity coalesces with temporary space. And maybe that's a possible solution for managing these diverse identities. How do we define and design temporary spaces? How do we make these connections? Maybe the rest of the year we can't, or the rest of the week we can't. Maybe the community has infighting or is fighting with another community. Is there some way to develop and create a temporary space to bring these people together? It might be a week, just 1 week long. And then they go back to fighting for the 51 weeks of the year. And then maybe another week next year becomes 2 weeks. And then they begin to understand each other, and that temporary space has power and meaning and importance. And one more example of temporary space is on the next slide here.
Do you recognize this? This is a temporary space. Most students don't realize it. Most don't realize it. Even the faculty may not realize it. But every year, students come and go. They come and go, new admissions, graduations. Maybe they stay for 5 or 6 or 7 years, but if it's an undergraduate, it could be a 6 or 7 year plan. But they come and then they go. That's the point. So when I started at Gallaudet, I had a friend of mine. He used to be my campus minister. And he said, good luck, when I first got there. And the second thing he said was, you're preaching to the parade. You stand in a place, and the students in the community will parade by you. Every 4 or 5 years, there will be a completely new group of people. You can never rest. You can never assume anything. And the parade will keep moving. Just a procession will continue, and that has proven to be true. I stayed at Gallaudet for 5 years, most of my freshman year, and then I graduated and moved on. The freshmen that I had been preaching to had moved on, and that proved itself as a temporary space. That community was temporary. Everyone had a wonderful time together for the time that they were there, and then they went back to where they came from. Right now at spring break, everyone's gone. I stopped by my office before I came here to pick up a few things, and the campus was completely empty. Instead, there were groups of Hearing High School students who were touring during their spring break, coming to see what Gallaudet was like, wanting to see what a deaf university was like. And it was the strangest thing in the world to go into Gallaudet and see all of these hearing people. Very bizarre. But it struck me when I noticed that. Every year, it happens in the summer too. The students leave the campus, and outside groups come in for summer training programs and various things. It's interesting to sit there and watch that parade change. So a university is a temporary space. They already exist as that. Now we're going to talk about Judith Butler from the University of California. Her idea is that gender is something that is performed. Your body has a sex assigned to it. It might be a male or a female or intersex. There's a wide range. You may opt for surgery to change something during your lifetime, but sex is not necessarily fixed. It's fluid. Gender is completely different. It might be related to sex, but if someone's sex is male or female or intersexed, their gender may be masculine, feminine, or something in between. Transgender is what we call that. There's a wide range. Who they are in the morning may be different from the gender that they're performing in the afternoon. They might go back to work with a suit and tie, they get home and change into a dress. How you perform your gender is how you express yourself. That's a social construct. It depends on how you perform it. So you're always on the stage. That stage is where we perform all of our different identities. I'm deaf now, but it might be different from how I'm deaf at Gallaudet, or how I'm deaf with my other deaf friends. How I'm a man now, or how I'm a man later in the day, how I'm a man later when I'm at home watching basketball, these are all different identities of being a man. We perform those identities, and we can continue to recreate those. They're not fixed. They're not permanent identities. Identity itself is a temporary space. It is a stage on which you stand and perform. This stage on the slide is empty. It represents an opportunity. So going back to the big stage, Syracuse University. There might be disabled people discussing things. There might be the deaf community discussing things. Religious communities discussing things amongst themselves. Secular atheist groups discussing things. LGBT communities. Women's Rights Month. We have discussions about Women's History Month. All these various issues that we face. So do I go to the lecture with the deaf guy tonight or with the women's history lecture? You know, you have to decide. Thanks for coming, by the way. But these are decisions. How different identities pull us in different directions. How do they pull us in ways that bring us to different groups? Those are created temporary spaces. And you can take advantage of the temporary spaces that have already been created, such as the ones that we've discussed that are here at SU. One community might not understand another community, and there might be fighting, and that's when we need to figure out how to design a temporary space to bring those two together. IFYC, the Interfaith Youth Corps, got an award from last year for partnership and goals, for collaboration. Different religious groups didn't understand each other, didn't know how to receive each other, but when they got together, it served to help the community. You know, they could feed the homeless and have fundraisers together. And not have to sit around and debate what the religions say and who's right and wrong, rather just get together and focus on the work that needs to be done. And maybe talk about other things that they have in common, like classes that they're taking as they're doing that service work. And they can learn from each other in those spaces in a much more natural way. That's a temporary space in action. So designing a temporary space really just means creating a collaboration between various groups. It can be kind of risky and scary, but it's worth a chance worth taking. So I've been talking for a while. I'm going to turn it over to the audience now to have a discussion about how SU uses temporary spaces. Maybe before you can answer that, where do we need to create a temporary space here at SU to come together on various things where we can have ideas without tearing people in half or in fourths or in eighths? We can allow that portfolio of identities and create a temporary space to honor the whole person. Where is the need for that here? That's my first question to you. And second, how would that happen? So I want you to have a discussion with each other about those two questions. And thank you.